One of the things human beings did, because we were preyed upon and became predators, one of the things we did was imitate the predator, and so we were in awe of a predatory animal, like we still might be if you meet a grizzly bear in the woods. You might freeze, and you're certainly going to attend to it. But then there's part of you that is deeply called upon to imitate the capacity for aggression of the predator, so that you can defend your loved ones against predatory action. And some of that would be to be the warrior that can fight off the grizzly bear, but then abstracted up into the religious sense, it would be to be the ethical actor who can protect your family from unscrupulous psychopaths, forces of malevolence that border on the satanic. And that's all part of the ethical enterprise. And weirdly enough, all of your acts of perception are necessarily nested inside a structure that's pointing to what is at the highest, or you're incoherent. Those are the options. Well, that's a strange thing, right? Because you can say, well, maybe your hierarchy of value isn't unified and there's nothing at the top. It's like, okay, it's not unified. Well, then you're confused. And if you're with someone and your hierarchies of value aren't unified, then you are in conflict. Or you're aimless, or you're hopeless, or you're anxious, or you're lost. That's the phenomenological consequence of lacking this united pyramidal ethic. So you can't get away from the necessity of this unless you want to live, aimless, nihilistic, confused, hopeless, all of that. People are aware of the future in ways that animals aren't, or animals are only partially aware. We're very aware of the future and aware of our mortal limitations in a manner that seems unique to human beings. And we constantly sacrifice the present to the future. That's actually the definition of work. And that emerges very early on in the biblical narrative corpus, the idea that humans are destined to work, but that also work is the sacrifice of the present. And that's part of the fall in some sense. It's the sacrifice of the present to the future. And we regard that as the hallmark of maturity, fundamentally, right? Can you delay gratification? Well, if the answer is no, it's, well, then you're 2. Can you delay gratification? Well, then, I mean that technically, because 2-year-olds can't delay gratification, which makes it very difficult for other people to play with them, for example. If you can delay gratification, then you can work. If you can work, then you're mature. It's the definition of maturity and responsibility. It's so interesting to see that it pervades the act of attention itself, and that there's no, because I used to ask my students, because I was trying to figure this out, I'd ask them a question like, well, why are you writing this essay? Or what are you doing when you're writing this essay? That's a better question. So you think, what is someone doing when writing an essay? And one answer is, say they're doing it on a computer. Well, they're moving their fingers up and down. And that's actually a really good answer, because that's not an idea, right? Moving your fingers up and down, that's not an idea. That's where your spirit meets your body. You're actually moving something physical. And you don't really have consciousness of the musculature, or you don't know how you move your fingers, but you can do it. And so at the highest level of resolution, when you're writing an essay, you're moving your fingers. And now you know how to type, and you have automated structures for doing that. And then you're composing words, and the words are in phrases, and the phrases are in sentences, and the sentences are in paragraphs, and the paragraphs are in sections, and the whole thing makes an essay. But then that's a subset of a class, and you want to grade for the class because you want to pass the class, because you want to get your degree. But why do you want to get your degree? It's, well, maybe you're interested in that field of study, and you think being a scholar is a good thing, and you want to have a job. And so while you're writing an essay, what are you doing? Preparing to have your career? And then are you doing that because you want to be a good citizen and a good father, perhaps a good mother? And do you want to do that because you want to be a good person? Or are you mixed up in all of that? So you're doing all of those things well or badly at the same time, all the time, with everything you do, all the time. And there's no way around that. It can't be simplified. The whole structure has to be there. And that's another reason why we don't have general purpose robots yet, is that they're just not embedded in that ethic that stretches all the way up from the most minute motor patterns of action and perception to the highest possible ethical striving.
You realize that in order to exist in the world, you're constantly having to sacrifice. That is, you have to sacrifice the idiosyncrasies in order to be able to grasp the object, because this can be all kinds of things, right? It could be a dog's chew toy, it could be a million things. But in order to be able to grasp it, I have to sacrifice the idiosyncrasies. And I also have to somehow, let's say, recognize it in its highest form, or kind of move it towards its highest form. And that seems to be an aspect of religious thinking, which is actually part of attention, which is sacrifice.
Well, the sacrificial aspect of attention in part is that whenever you see something as that thing, you sacrifice the possibility of all the other things it could be. And that's delimiting to a large degree. You know, it hems you in, but that's also a relief, because, you know, how many bloody million things do you want to attend to at one time? But so part of the reason, you know, the idea of sacrifice, conscious idea of sacrifice, emerges very early on, for example, in the biblical writings, because the second story in Genesis, there's this insistence that, so human beings are already destined to work as a consequence of the fall out of the Garden of Eden. But the Cain and Abel story is specifically about sacrifice and about the degree to which a sacrifice has to be of the highest quality. So you have this one protagonist, Abel, who's a prototype for a mode of being that stretches throughout history. And Abel's sacrifices are to the highest, to that which is the highest imaginable. So he's aiming as high as he can. And they're genuine and honest. And the consequence of that is that God smiles upon him, let's say, but that his life is extremely successful. He gets everything that a sensible human being would want and need. And he's contrasted with Cain, who's bitter and arrogant and makes second-rate sacrifices. And you want to think about that personally. It's like, well, did you give it your best shot when you failed? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, who are you trying to fool exactly? You trying to fool yourself? Well, good luck with that. You trying to fool other people? It's like, well, who made you so smart and them so dumb? And is that how you think about other people? You can just pull the wool over their eyes? And then is it more than that? Do you think you can bend the structure of reality? And so you're going to make these half-witted sacrifices, and that's going to please God too? And that's what you believe? And, you know, Cain is very annoyed that his sacrifices aren't being rewarded, and he goes and talks to God and basically calls him out and says something like, you know, kind of stupid cosmos did you make here? Here I am breaking myself in half, and all the good things are going to Abel. It's like, what's up with you? Which is really quite the thing to do, you know. And if you don't think people do that, you don't know much about them. And God basically tells them, well, people do that all the time, which is why it's an archetypal story. And God basically tells Cain that he doesn't make good sacrifices. He knows that perfectly well, that he was tempted by bitterness and arrogance and deceit to enter into a consensual sexual relationship with the spirit of vengeful sin itself, which is a hell of an accusation.
Think of a basketball player. I like to always bring it to something that at first not religious at all for people to see what we're talking about. The basketball player has to sacrifice a million things that all his friends are doing that are fun or that he could be doing. He has to take away all the idiosyncrasies and focus on one thing. And then that's when the Abel sacrifice comes in. He has to give his best. If he doesn't give his best, then he won't make it. There's no way. And so the sacrificial pattern enters into pretty much any type of excellence.
You don't know what you could do. You don't know what's possible. And you're not as much as you could be. And so God only knows what you could do and have and give if you sacrificed everything to it. And that's the reason Abraham is constantly making sacrifices. And it's archaic, right? He's burning up like baby lambs, but well, they're alive, you know, that's something. And they're valuable, and that's something. You have to admit, even if you think about it as a modern person, that the act of sacrificing something might have some dramatic compulsion to it. You know, to go out into a flock and to take something that's newborn and to cut its throat and to bleed it and to burn it. might be a way of indicating to yourself that you're actually serious about something. And it isn't so obvious that we have rituals of seriousness like that now. And so it's not so obvious that we're actually serious about anything. And so maybe that's not such a good thing. And so maybe we shouldn't be thinking that these people were so archaic and primitive and superstitious. It's possible that they knew something that we don't. And certainly in the Abrahamic stories, one of the things that maintains Abraham's covenant with God is his continual willingness to sacrifice. And it's so that sacrificial issue is so important because you are not committed to something unless you're willing to sacrifice for it. Commitment and sacrifice are the same thing. And I think it borders on miraculous that those concepts are embedded into this narrative at the level of dramatic action, instead of abstract explanation. People are acting this out. And the fundamental conception is so profound that it's really quite awe-inspiring. It's breathtaking, really, when you understand what message is trying to be conveyed. You have to make sacrifices. And what do you have to sacrifice? You have to sacrifice that which is most valuable to you currently that's stopping you. And God only knows what that is. It's certainly the worst of you. It's certainly that. And God only knows to what degree you're in love with the worst of you. So why work 80 hours a week? Well, men will do it. Some men, very few. A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed with hitting the pinnacle of the given dominance hierarchy they're in will happily work 80 hours a week, and they'll forego everything else. Relationships, family, children, way in the second category. And so those men are often very difficult to live with too, because they're so obsessed with their career. It's hard to have a relationship with them. And maybe they don't have much of a relationship with their kids, but they're damn good at what they do. And part of that is they're smart and disciplined, and they'll work non-stop all the time. It's like an obsession. And that's the sort of people who run things. Those are the people who run things. Well, they're often also disagreeable too, because you want to manage people? Really? They're not going to like you. And it's not an easy thing to not be liked. And actually, if you're an agreeable person, and women are more agreeable than men, it's quite painful to be disliked. But if you're in a managerial and executive position, the probability that people are going to like you is quite low. Those positions are very stressful, partly because of the interpersonal dynamics, and they're also incredibly, incredibly competitive. So we've got things backwards in our culture. We're thinking, at least in part, why aren't there more women in positions of power? Wrong question. The right question is, why are there any men at all who want those positions of power? Because it's not just positions of power. You have to be such a knothead to think that. Oh, it's a position of power. It's like, sure, but it's a position of overwhelming responsibility. And if you make mistakes, you're done. Right? It's not like you occupy that position of power and everyone does what they're told all the time and your life is easy. It's like, forget about that. People are on your case to do exactly the right thing all the time, 100% of the time. And maybe you want that and maybe you don't. So I don't know what people think is these people are all sitting in their offices with their feet up on the desk, smoking cigars and oppressing the world. It's like, that isn't how it works. Those people, they work flat out all the time. So, and it's fine if that's what you want, and some people are like that. They're hyper-industrious people, right? From a trait perspective, no matter where you put them. If you put them in a forest with an axe, they just wander around chopping down trees non-stop, right? Because it's built into them. But if you want to have a balanced life, and you should want that, because the other thing you'll find, and this is God's gospel truth, is that the older you get, if you have any sense at all, the more important your family is to you. Like the utility of your career, maybe that peaks around 35 or 40, and it starts to decline pretty rapidly after that. And what happens, if you're fortunate, you have someone in your life that you love, that you've woven yourself together with, and you have some kids so that you have something to do from the time you're 50 till the time you're 80. And so it's a real mistake. It's a barren future without children, man. I can tell you that. It's a real mistake. And so we do a terrible job of say, putting that image forward and saying, well, yeah, now, because women have access to the birth control pill now and can compete in the same domains as men, roughly speaking, there is a real practical problem here. It's partly an economic problem now, because when I was roughly your age, it was still possible for a one-income family to exist. Well, you know that wages have been flat except in the upper 1% since 1973. Why? Well, it's easy. What happens when you double the labor force? What happens? You have the value of labor. So now we're in a situation where it takes 2 people to make as much as 1 did before. So we went from a situation where women's career opportunities were relatively limited to where they were relatively unlimited and there were 2 incomes to where, and so women could work, to a situation where women have to work and they only make half as much as they would have otherwise. And now we're going to go into a situation, this is the next step, whereas women will work because men won't. And that's what's coming now. So there was an economist article showing that 50% now of boys in school are having trouble with their basic subjects. And you look around you in universities, you can see this happening. I've watched it over decades. I would say 90% of the people in my personality class are now women. There won't be a damn man left in university in 10 years, except in the STEM fields. And it's a complete bloody catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe for women because I don't know where the hell you're going to find someone to have a, to marry and have a family with if this keeps happening.
I talked to Frans de Waal 2 weeks ago, and that'll be out soon, and he's the world's greatest living primatologist, perhaps. De Waal's work is unbelievably important. It's unbelievably important because he's concentrated on the idea of the alpha male. And we have in popular parlance, we have an idea of the alpha chimp, right? Or the alpha male for that matter. And it's pretty much a postmodern neo-Marxist view of primate sociology. And that is that the biggest, ugliest, meanest male dominates by brute force. And so now he's at the top of the pyramid. And so the implicit claim there from the biologists is that power, those who express power most effectively, power being the ability to compel, those who express power most effectively will dominate the pyramid of dominance, of social hierarchy, and they'll prevail reproductively. Well, that's pretty gloomy, that idea, but people think, well, that's how you look at the world if you're sensible. It's like, well, Frans de Waal's been studying chimps for 30 years, and that's not true. That is not what happens. He told me flat out that frequently small male can become alpha, especially if he has the support of an influential female. And the small male becomes alpha and has the support of the influential female, not because he expresses arbitrary power, but because he's unbelievably good at mutual reciprocation. And so he has friends, and he does things for his friends, and they do things for him, and they trust each other, and he has lots of friends, which also means he has no enemies, which turns out to be really important because the brute chimps, like the psychopath alphas, they do rule now and then, but they get torn to shreds by their enemies because they're tough, let's say, and mean, but they have an off day, and 2 chimps they stomped a week before ally together and literally tear them into shreds. And so the psychopath chimp types who use power to attain dominance have very short rules and end in a very bloody way. And so de Waal has pointed out, like Piaget did among children, that power is an unstable ethic upon which to base a social hierarchy, even for chimps. And chimps are male-dominated, they have a patriarchal society, and they're relatively brutal. And it doesn't even work for them. It certainly doesn't work for human beings. So whatever is at the apex of the pyramid, it's not, as the bloody Marxists insist, the raw expression of power and exploitation. Wrong. Not the case. Doesn't even work in nature. Doesn't work for rats. Doesn't work for chimpanzees. Certainly doesn't work for people. And then there is a kind of natural ethic that emerges out of that, right? Because with rats and with chimps and other social animals, it varies to some degree from species to species, there's the necessity for something like mutual reciprocity as the basis for successful social organization. And that's something like treat your neighbor like you would want to be treated.
You watch all those rom-coms where there's always kind of a beta male guy who's being real friendly and always failing miserably with the women because basically he's lying to himself and to them. He's a persona. And a persona is the face that you show to the world when you're trying to pretend and to convince yourself and others that you're, I would say harmless, but we could say a good person. But a good person isn't harmless. A good person is capable of, well, maybe a good person is capable of anything, but is willing to hold that in abeyance. The first thing you have to understand with regards to trying to come to terms with the conception of the shadow is to understand the idea of persona. And persona is the you that you present when you want people to accept and like you. Often like. Let's say that you go to a party and you're trying to impress the people that are there and you're trying to get them to like you. And so maybe you get jabbed at a little bit and you laugh and you go along with everyone so that they like you, and then you go home and you're bitterly resentful about the way that you were put down at this party. And that's going to make all sorts of aggressive, I wish I could have said, it's going to make all sorts of aggressive and vengeful thoughts sort of flash through your imagination. Well, the first part of the problem is that you were too much persona, right? You sacrificed yourself in some sense at the party so that people would like you. And in the second part, you're refusing to admit to the existence of those elements of you that would have actually protected you from doing that. So let's say you go home and you're all bitter and resentful and you have fantasies of revenge. I mean, that reveals to you the shadow part of you that's aggressive. And the thing is, you actually need that, because if you would have integrated that more successfully into your personality, when you went to the party, you wouldn't have had to let people put you down to get them to like you. Instead of having a face like this, which says, I'll take anything that's coming my way, you have a face and a stance that's more determined and assertive. And if you manifest that properly, people aren't going to mess with you to begin with. But you may have already adopted a morality that says, well, I have to be likable and I shouldn't do anything that causes any conflict and I shouldn't ever, hurt anybody's feelings. And so you're just to present yourself as a punching bag, and you think that that makes you a good person, but it doesn't. And there's no integration of the shadow in that situation. So you see that at the end of the movie, when I mentioned this, when Simba climbs up the rock to take control of it, all the female lionesses bare their teeth and he roars. It's like that aggressiveness is integrated into him. And so resentment is a really good emotion for making contact with the shadow side, because if you're resentful about something, it basically reveals two things. It either means that you're immature and you should stop whining and get on with things. Someone's asked, this often happens with adolescents who are asked, say, by their mother to clean up their room. They get all resentful about it. It's like, shut up and clean up your room. It's not that much to ask. Or, so that can be a gateway into the observation of your own immaturity. Or, it's possible that you're resentful because people really have been poking at you too much and taking cheap shots at you and oppressing you. But what that means is that you've got some things to say that you haven't been willing to say or don't know how to say, right? You can't stand up for yourself properly. And in order to do that, you have to grow some teeth and be willing to use them. And again, that's something that might violate your morality, because you might say, well, I shouldn't be able to bite people. And the thing is, yes, you should be able to bite people hard. And if you're able to bite them, then generally you don't have to. But they need to know that you can, because otherwise, especially people who are badly socialized, they'll just keep encroaching on you and encroaching on you and encroaching on you and encroaching on you until you put up a wall. Like someone who's really well put together won't do that, because they're sophisticated. But if you run into people who only have boundaries because other people impose them on them and you won't do it, you're going to be the bullied one in the office, for example. You're not going to get a raise. People aren't going to credit you with your own work. Other people are going to take credit for it. And you're going to go home angry because you're doing your best and you're trying to get along with everyone and nothing ever goes your way. Well, it's because you're a pushover. And you think that's good because you confuse harmlessness with morality.
It's not right. Just because you can't do any damage doesn't mean you're moral. It just means you don't have the capability for mayhem. And that makes you a pushover. I mean, first of all, I do not believe that compassion is an untrammeled moral virtue. And I think one of the terrible things about our society, one of the deadly Oedipal things about our society, is that we've put compassion in the highest place unthinkingly. And compassion is for infants. And I really mean that technically. So, like, if imagine that your ethic was that you were 100% compassionate. Okay, so what are you like? Well, you're like a good mother with a child under 6 months of age. Because human babies are born premature in some fundamental sense. So, the average gestation period for a mammal of about our size should be 2 years. And so our babies are born radically premature, and there's complex reasons for that. One is that there's an evolutionary arms race between the circumference of the infant's head and the dimensions of the pelvic hole through which the baby has to pass to be born. And if the pelvis of women was any wider, they couldn't run. And if it was any narrower, then the child would die, like many children did, right? I mean, the human birth mortality rate was abysmal right up till about, certainly 100 years ago. And the babies' heads are compressible, right? The bones aren't fully formed when they're born, and often kids are born and their heads are cone-shaped because they've been subject to such pressure during birth. So it's a narrow needle to thread, and there's been a lot of evolutionary tinkering to get that right. So, our infants are born unbelievably helpless, and they are basically prenatal until they can crawl, and that's 7 or 8 months. And so prior to that, because they're so utterly helpless, everything they do has to be regarded as above moral reproach and 100% right. And so if you have an infant who is crying, who's 6 months old or 4 months old, your job is not to judge the infant or to punish the infant or to discipline the infant. It's like the infant has a problem, and all of your attention is to be focused on solving that problem. Period. 100%, that's it. And that's great for people who are under 6 months. But it's deadly. It's increasingly deadly as the child matures, because that kind of all-encompassing, I will do everything for you, is also the enemy of development. And that's the whole Freudian nightmare. I mean, that's what Freud put his finger on, and he knew that was the pathology of the age, the Oedipal mother. And it's like, welcome to the age of the Oedipal mother, everyone, because that's certainly what we see now. And so if you put compassion in the highest place, well, then that's what you have a state of being where everything is an infant, and the only hallmark of ethic is pity. Now, Jung talked about classic conceptions of what is in the highest place, God. He said, well, God rules with two hands, mercy and justice. And that's that discrimination. You know how bad discrimination is. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's differentiation. It's judgment. It's putting things in their proper place. It's setting the highest above the lowest. It's formulating a pathway for further development. And, a mother might say, you're just fine the way you are. But what's that to say to someone who's, 10? It's like, you're not fine the way you are. You're 10. You got a lot of growing up to do, and you're probably not fine the way you are when you're 20. It's like, you're just a fraction of what you could be. And if it's all maternal compassion, and I mean that in the symbolic sense, it's all maternal compassion, where's the impetus for development? And there's no judgment there. And I think the most dismal thing you can tell 18-year-old boys in particular, especially if they're miserable, is, well, you're just okay the way you are. And they're not, first of all, and no one thinks they are, including them. Well, they don't. No one gives a damn about malfunctioning 18-year-old boys. Like, but you can say, with the proper admixture of justice and mercy, it's like, you're not so bad for 18, and you could be way more, and good for you, and then you can encourage that, and that's the spirit of justice, and that's a patriarchal spirit fundamentally. Right. It's the encouragement and the calling forth of further development. There has to be allowance for imperfection and error, well also also orientation towards the aim. Yeah, and getting that balance right, well, that's part of what consciousness does, I would say, is it constantly adjudicates between those two higher order principles. Now, those aren't the only principles, but and there's no final solution to that, right? You can't just say, well, we're all compassionate and we're done with it. It's like, no. And it's an ongoing problem, right? With your kids, you're always wondering, they make a mistake. It's, well, how much do you forgive them? And how much do you say, how about you don't do that again? It's really embarrassing. It's terrible for you. If you replicate that error, your life is going to be a bloody catastrophe. You're old enough to figure it out. It's like, clue in. And you might say, well, who loves the child more? The one who says, oh, it's okay, everything you do is lovely, which it isn't. Or the person who says, you could do better. And, the answer is, well, it's a discussion between those two viewpoints constantly, because, and in your relationship with yourself, it's like, how much do you forgive yourself? And the answer certainly is 0. It's not 0. That's, no one can live without being able to forgive themselves to some degree. But by the same token, you don't want to let yourself off the hook for every idiot error you make.
What is your view on the book/movie Fight Club? I thought Fight Club was deeply fascist in a very interesting way. I'm saying that in some way dismissively, although I actually liked the movie. I also think it was fascist because it was a celebration in some sense of force. It was fascist sort of in the same way that the Iron Man character is fascist, But I also thought it was a really interesting exploration of the idea of developing the shadow. And I do believe that if men don't become consciously dangerous, they become unconsciously dangerous. And so it's much better to become consciously dangerous. And it's something that every man should really aim at. So you should be someone that no one will mess with. But then you should keep that under control, right? First of all, you should be harmless and naive. Then you're a child. Then you should develop your capacity to be dangerous. Then you should bring that capacity to be dangerous under control. Then that makes you a man, as far as I'm concerned.
Nietzsche said, well, God is dead and we have killed him and we'll never find the water to wash away the blood. The holiest that we have created has now died at our own hands. And he thought that was an absolute catastrophe because Nietzsche was a very smart man and a very wise man. But he made a real error, I believe, and he posited that because of this collapse of values, this precipitous collapse of the value that unifies all values, or that is the precondition for all values, that we would be lost. He certainly felt that we would fall into nihilism, or that we would fall prey to communist idolatry in particular, which he predicted dead on, just like Dostoevsky did. But then he also said the solution to that will be that the Superman will have to appear, the Übermensch, and he will be the man who can create his own values. And so both Freud and Jung were interested in that idea. Freud more peripherally, but Jung more consciously. And part of what Jung was trying to find out is, well, could we create our own values? And the answer he came up with was, no, that's not possible. And why? So the question is why? Well, for the psychoanalysts, we were beset by fantasies, and these are sort of autonomous personalities that dwell in our subconscious, let's say, in our imagination, in our dreams, and that possess us from time to time. The spirit of rage, the spirit of lust, the spirit of envy, these ancient gods that possess us, and these values and temptations and impulses that come upon us that we cannot control. They're part of our autonomous nature. And because they have this autonomy, and so that would be the autonomy of emotions and the autonomy of motivations, and then even the autonomy of the spirit that unites motivations, because we don't know, for example, in the spirit of play, for example, play is an instinct. Play integrates base motivations into a higher unity, but it's an instinct. And so Jung realized very rapidly that it wasn't technically possible for us to create our own values. And that's partly his stumbling upon the problem of complexity. So the world's just too complex for us to generate our values in the span of a single life, out of whole cloth, autonomously, no matter how much of a Superman we were. And partly the reason that's impossible is, well, okay, so generate your own values. What the hell are you going to do with your wife or your husband or your friend? What are they going to, they're just going to live by your values all of a sudden? Well, that's what the postmodernists are demanding now. The radical types, it's like, my game, right? My identity. I'm whatever I say I am, moment to moment. And there's no negotiation. And that's because they're 2 years old. And I mean that. I mean that. I mean that technically. I mean, one of the things I learned partly from reading Freud had this idea of developmental fixation, and he noticed in his clients, in his patients, that people would get stuck at a developmental level. And so you'd be talking to an adult and all of a sudden they were 4 years old. And I learned to see that in my clients, and well, in people I talk to, I'll do that with if they're annoying me. You know, like, okay, who the hell are you? Oh, I see. You're a 13-year-old mean girl. Okay, away we go. I know who I'm talking to now. And these solipsistic identity totalitarians are 2 years old. And 2-year-olds are very governed by emotion. They're completely incapable of negotiation. They're egotistical in that their worldview dominates. They have no notion whatsoever of negotiated play. And their belief is their identity is 100% generated by them, dependent on what they feel moment to moment, which is exactly how a 2-year-old operates. And most of them get socialized out of that by the age of 4. And those that don't have a very dismal time of it after that. So, and I think we have a lot of people like that now because screens have interfered with pretend play and negotiation, and because Oedipal parents and social systems have enabled a kind of immature narcissism that makes itself manifest in these absurd claims about identity. And that's all part of creating your own values. I can be whatever sex I want to be moment to moment. It's like, well, fine, but how are other people supposed to deal with that? Because they don't know what to do. Well, it doesn't matter. They have to do exactly what I want them to. It's like, hey, good luck with that. You Superman, you Ubermensch with your own values. And this is also partly why the small L liberal types are wrong in a fundamental sense, and this would include most therapists, is like, you might think of identity and of sanity itself as sort of an internal psychological arrangement, you know, so you have your act together, it's sort of in your brain or in your psyche, and you're sane, and there's insane people around you, but you're sane. It's like, that isn't really right. It's sort of right, but, you know, you're sane if you're a reciprocal partner in your marriage. You're sane if you have 3 or 4 friendships that you've been able to maintain, because you can act reciprocally. And the sanity is actually the balance between you and your wife or husband, and then you and your wife or husband and your friends, or you and your wife and your husband, or your husband and your children and your friends and your larger family. It's this nested thing that we already talked about. It's like, you can't be sane in the absence of that, because that's actually the definition of sanity. And it's collective as well, as that's why the kingdom of God is within you and without you. It's exactly that. It's like, yeah, you have a harmonious psyche, but, you know, are you dancing with yourself to music that no one else can hear? That's not helpful. There's a communal element of it that has to be in place. And so if you're sane, your marriage is sane, and you have sane relationships with your children, you have sane relationships with your friends, and you're a good employee or a boss, and you're a participant in the civic world, and all of that is embedded in this hierarchy that has the spirit at the top that enables that reciprocity to operate. It's not easy to find your own words, but if you find your own words, and they're truthful words, there isn't anything that can stop them. You think, well, do you believe that? Well, let's go back to the sovereign idea. Are you sovereign citizens or not? Well, if you are, well, why is that? Well, it's because you have a certain faculty, a certain power. Well, what do you have? You have the power of your convictions and your truth and your ability to communicate. And that's what's supposed to set the state straight. Okay, so you have that. It's like, well, then maybe it's truth that you're pursuing and seeking, if you have any sense. And what's truth? Well, truth is the best reflection you can manage of reality. Imperfect, because you're imperfect, but it's the best you've got. It's like, what's going to be better for you than to have reality on your side? And what's going to stand in your way if you have reality on your side? Lies? I don't think so. That isn't how it works. And I don't think anyone believes that, because the other thing I've noted and discussed with people frequently is if you have someone that you love, a child, let's say, and you're trying to raise a child in a decent manner, you don't tell them, look, kid, this is how the world runs. Everything's corrupt beyond belief, including you and your parents and society and nature for that matter. It's just complete bloody hell everywhere. And the only possible way that you can make it through life effectively is to learn to lie as brilliantly and undisguisedly as possible. No one does that. Well, why not? If you believed in falsehood, if you believed that that was the way forward, then that would be the right thing to teach. But you don't. You teach your children to tell the truth, even if it's painful. And the reason for that is that you actually believe in the power of the truth.